Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Global Taiwan Institute. For all of you joining us here in person as well as online. My name is Russell Shao. I am the Executive Director here at GTI. GTI is a 501c3 think tank dedicated exclusively to Taiwan policy research and related programs. Our mission is to enhance the relationship between the United States and Taiwan with the world by contributing to a more informed discussion about Taiwan and its people. In pursuit of that vision, we undertake several major programs. They include our bi-weekly Global Taiwan brief, very timely analysis and informed opinions about current developments related to Taiwan, our regular public seminar series, an annual symposium that we host in the fall featuring policy practitioners and leading experts and scholars on Taiwan issues, as well as podcasts and scholarship opportunities as well. If you're not already subscribed to receive all our program updates and any new opportunities that may arise, you may do so by visiting our website at www.globaltaiwan.org and subscribe to receive our newsletters. We are truly delighted to be able to present today's event, Taiwan in 2024. For many countries around the world, this year promises to be a very eventful year. Over the next 12 months, many nations throughout the world will be having elections. And while each of these contests will likely have significant and different ramifications, the elections just held in Taiwan, as well as the one that we are going to have here in the United States in November, are stand out, particularly noteworthy. So on January 13th, voters in Taiwan have decided to hand the ruling Democratic Progressive Party an unprecedented third consecutive term in office by electing Xi Jinping and Shelby Kim as their president and vice president. The opposition Chinese Nationalist Party, or the Kuomintang, obtained a plurality of seats in the legislative branch of the government, the legislative yuan, with 52 out of 113 seats. That represent a gain of 14 seats from the prior legislative yuan election in 2020. The ruling Democratic Progressive Party did not fare as well in the legislative yuan race, losing a total of 10 seats, dropping from 61 to 51. With the TPP, the Taiwan People's Party, the third party challenger in this presidential as well as legislative race, with a small but nonetheless decisive 8 votes in the legislative yuan, which would be necessary for cooperation, for passing, or even blocking legislations in the government. All of these various developments have different implications for governance, cross-strait issues, for U.S.-Taiwan relations that we can certainly unpack and examine in greater depth in our both the conversation that we are about to have with this group of expert panelists, but also in the questions and answers. As previously noted, the outcome of these elections will weigh on the efficacy of the policies for the incoming Xi administration, which I think, as many observers expect, will continue much of the defense, economic, and foreign policy approaches of the Tsai administration. Just to highlight a few points, President-elect Lai has said that maintaining security across the Taiwan Strait and peace in the Indo-Pacific would be his, quote, most important mission, end quote, as president. Accordingly, he has repeatedly pledged to maintain the status quo in cross-strait relations and will base his cross-strait China policy on the ROC constitutional framework, suggesting thereby that he is unlikely to deliberately try to provoke Beijing in different shapes and forms, notably perhaps by declaring Detroit independence, as some observers may be concerned as a result of his self-identification as a pragmatic worker for Taiwan independence. All this will also include a continuation of the Tsai administration's emphasis on deepening security and defense cooperation with the United States, as well as with like-minded allies and partners. The president-elect has also committed to developing asymmetric defense capabilities during the campaign, of which he has pledged to Taiwan transition into an asymmetric fighting force, focusing on cost-effective and mobile capabilities. He will also very likely continue to emphasize to broaden Taiwan's economic relationship and continue de-risking its overdependence on China. In this regard, it seems likely that he will continue his Tsai administration's new southbound policy, which has been designed to strengthen Taiwan's relationship with the 10 countries of the ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, the 6 states of South Asia, as well as Australia and New Zealand. Clearly, the world was closely watching these elections, but perhaps none more so than the People's Republic of China, which is postured to ratchet up its military, political, and economic pressure on Taiwan. And we've already seen some indications of Beijing's intent and strategy going forward. This is also happening against the backdrop of rising demographic and economic issues within China, which could certainly inject some additional uncertainty into the equation and the cost benefit calculations of the leadership as it weighs different considerations of how it would engage or punish the Xi administration. Meanwhile, tensions between China and the United States continue to simmer, despite the moderating effects of a recent summit, or the September summit between Xi Jinping and U.S. President Joseph Biden. And it is against this volatile geopolitical backdrop that the security relationship between Taiwan and the United States enters a very critical year. So today, I'm very pleased to be able to assemble this expert group of panelists to examine how elite politics and domestic politics in China could influence its decision-making with regards to Taiwan. What are the specific types of measures, both economic and military, that China may take against Taiwan? Accordingly, how can the United States and Taiwan capitalize on some of the positive momentums of the past several years, as well as what are the challenges ahead in the coming year? So allow me to just briefly introduce our experts. To my immediate left, we have Dr. Willie Woolop-Lamb, who is a senior fellow at the Jamestown Foundation, where he is a regular and longtime contributor to the China Brief. He's also an adjunct professor over at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, as well as with different teaching and research associations at the University of British Columbia, as well as other institutions. He is, of course, the author of the most recent book. He's a prolific author and writer, but his most recent book, which I think he will be drawing from to inform our understanding about Xi Jinping and his design for Taiwan, is the book Xi Jinping, The Hidden Agendas of China's Ruler for Life, which was just released a few months ago. To his left, we have my colleague here, John Dodson, who is the Deputy Director here at GTI, a former U.S. Navy officer and professional staff member at the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission. He has in-depth expertise on local and national security issues related to the People's Republic of China, as well as U.S. policy towards East Asia. And joining us online, we have Karen Sutter, who is a specialist in Asian trade and finance at the Congressional Research Service. She has over 30 years of experience working on U.S.-Asia policy issues, cross-cutting economic, political, technological, and national security issues in government, business, and as well as the think tank community. Last but not least, and also joining us online is another colleague and dear friend, Alexander Gray, who's a senior fellow in national security affairs over at the American Foreign Policy Council, as well as a senior non-resident fellow here at GTI. He also serves as the chief executive officer over at the American Global Strategy, a consultancy he has helped found with the former National Security Advisor, Robert O'Brien. I would just add that Ambassador O'Brien also chaired a task force established by the Global Taiwan Institute, and most recently published a report providing comprehensive recommendations about advancing U.S.-Taiwan relationship in a changing global partner landscape. Now, all of these reports, including this task force report, is available on our website. So please do visit the website and please download a copy of it. Now, I've asked each of the panelists to prepare, some opening comments on a set of issues that each of them are going to address, so that we can maximize the time that we have here with them. And so, just a note that we do want to hear from all of you here, both in person here at our office, as well as those joining us online. And for those of you joining us online, you may engage in the discussion by posing a question, by sending us an email over at contact@globaltaiwan.org, or by using the chat function on the YouTube. You can also tweet us as well, but please provide your name as well as your affiliation. Those that do will be prioritized. So with that, allow me to then turn the floor over to Willie, who will give us his take and an assessment on what he thinks will be Xi's policies and approaches for Taiwan now that we are entering the live administration of May, when the new president, the president will be inaugurated. Live? I'm sorry, not live. No, Willie. Okay, perfect.
Yeah, thank you very much, Russell. It's always a pleasure to come back to GTI. Thanks to the audience for coming over in very cold day. Well, my specialty is Chinese elite politics and China's foreign policy, including policy towards Taiwan. It's interesting to note that the official reactions from the PSC government seem to be quite restrained because many observers have been expecting perhaps some kind of a show of force, maybe not to the extent of scale missile exercise as was the case in the year 2000 and the year 1996, but at least an increase in the frequency of jet fighters crossing over the so-called middle line, Taiwan Strait, which is close to 200 miles wide, and also deployment of submarines and other naval vessels to intimidate Taiwan and to show, of course, their displeasure at the results of the election. I think this fairly restrained reaction dovetails with what had happened to China's foreign policy since the fateful tete-a-tete between Biden and Xi in San Francisco last November. Because since then, the Chinese have been very anxious to reassure, if not the American government, at least the American multinationals, which have been steadily but relentlessly withdrawing investment from the PRC. So we have a switch to some kind of a smart diplomacy, as was evidenced by Li Qiang's somewhat pro-business speech at the World Economic Forum. The fact that Beijing dispatched the head of the international liaison designer, Zhang Chao, who is a former assistant vice minister, to talk to the national security team and so forth. However, I think within Xi Jinping's mind, the most important consideration is still ideological and to some extent geopolitical. I think it is almost sure to predict that having secured a extended third five-year term in 20th Party Congress last October, that means he will definitely from October to October 7. It is almost a given that he will also get a fourth five-year term running into the year 2023, when Xi Jinping will be 79 years of age. However, we all know that China is a country that reveres old age. So for many people, well, politicians and intellectuals in their 70s have barely crossed the threshold into middle age. Okay, so it's even possible that Xi Jinping might continue after 2023, not only because he had big schemes on his face, but there was a precedent, including Deng Xiaoping, who never assumed the position of head of the party or state president, but Deng Xiaoping, from his return to power in 1978 until a few months after the June 4th massacre, was chairman of the Central Military Commission. And many people will consider the chairmanship of the CMC, which is equivalent to commander-in-chief, to be the position with the most power in China. Okay, so I would like first of all to address the issue of a projected timetable when Xi Jinping might take a move against Taiwan. I guess it is fair to say that it is not a question of whether, but just a question of when. Okay. Judging by conventional wisdom, Xi Jinping might have second thoughts about taking a move in his current five-year term. That means from last year until 2027. I don't have time to discuss in detail the recently strange events within the top echelon of the PLA. The fact that after the detention of two former defense ministers, away from her and General Li Shangfu, at least a few dozen major generals, lieutenant generals, and full generals, logistics, firemen, in the weapons acquisition departments, as well as most recently the commander of the strategic support department, General Zhu Xinsheng, as well as, and this is quite exceptional because Xi Jinping, like his two predecessors, Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao, spent a lot of effort grooming members of the so-called defense aerospace establishment and switching them over to key provincial positions. Recently, three top executives from Rinko, China's largest weapons making manufacturer, from the China Aerospace Science and Technology Corporation, China's Aerospace Science and Industry Corporation have been detained. Okay, so we can say that, for example, there is a good possibility that this healthy major changes at the top, particularly given the fact that during his first 10 years in office from 2012 to 2022, Xi Jinping had eliminated the two major rival factions in the party, namely the Shanghai Gang, headed by the late President Jiang Zemin, and also the one by Communist Youth League clique headed by former President Hu Jintao. He has appointed, he has groomed and appointed senior officials in the PLA, which he considers the most important pillar of the polity. Okay, so the fact that he has wielded the big knife against generals he had himself handpicked and promoted seems to indicate that the PLA is in a very bad shape. Okay, so there are reasons to believe that, given the fact that there is still a sizable gap between the military powers of the US and Japan on the one hand and China on the other, it is possible that Xi Jinping might consider invading Taiwan in one form or another during his last 4-5 year term, that means from 2027 to 2032. According to my information, one reason why Xi Jinping dared to stay in office as a so-called lifelong core CCP of the 党中央永久的核心 is that he has reassured his comrades that amongst the politicians, the top echelon, only he himself has the requisite qualifications, particularly knowledge of the PLA, to handle this gigantic, this Herculean task of taking over Taiwan, irrespective of which form and shape the invasion might take place, which we shall discuss perhaps in the Q&A period. However, there is a counter argument forwarded by several noted political scientists in the US and other places, and that is Xi Jinping might choose to act sooner rather than later because there is no possibility that PLA arsenal could catch up with the US in the foreseeable future, at least, or actually until the 2030s, the mid to late 2030s. So this argument was put forward to support the rationale for Japan's decision to invade Pearl Harbor. So the argument goes that it was not because Japan felt confident that it had the upper hand over the US Navy military forces, but because Japan feared that if it had not taken the decision then, it would have become too late because Japan already saw a decline of its energy supplies, of its military prowess, and so forth. So there's always a possibility that Xi Jinping, particularly given the fact that there's been a spectacular growth of projects within China, he might choose to divert attention sooner rather than later, apart from the strategic calculations. If war were declared against Taiwan, a national curfew would be imposed throughout China. Xi Jinping can arrest whoever he wants to arrest, and major cities like Beijing, Shanghai, Tianjin, including Hong Kong, would be turned into military ports. And I won't have time to discuss this, but there are pieces of evidence showing that there is a definite militarization of the populace. Okay, just one example is the setting up of militia within initially state-owned enterprise, SOE enterprises, and now even in the big private enterprises, they have set up company-wide militias. Okay, so that is a market and questionable militarization of the entire country in preparation for war regarding Taiwan or perhaps the South China Sea. And this tallies with one of Mao Zedong's most famous instructions, which is inject, okay, the symbiotic relationship between peace and war, okay, between the peacetime requirement and wartime requirements. Okay, I'm sorry to have gone over my time, and I switch over to the next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Willie, for that. It was very interesting and as well as sobering assessments. And I think next I want to turn it over to you, John. Willie, already mentioned that the PRC's reactions thus far to Taiwan's election as fairly restrained. But Admiral John Aquilino, the commander of the Indo-PACOM, also recently stated that he believes that China is likely to demonstrate force against Taiwan in the near term. And he added that when something occurs that they don't like, and take actions. So I want to turn it over to you to give us, your assessments on the PLA's military activities around Taiwan, as well as gray zone operations, and how you see the trend lines going forward over the next 4 years as we enter the Lai Chao administration.
All right, thanks, Russell, for the kind invitation earlier. Thanks to everyone for joining us today, if you're either here in person or those folks watching us online as well. Again, thanks for joining in the discussion today. A couple of ones. I've usually when taking part in a panel discussion like this, I usually do prepare a PowerPoint brief. I have not done so today. I'm not sure if that's a sign that I'm getting lazy or a positive sign that I'm finally breaking through U.S. Navy brainwashing. I'll leave that up to you folks to decide. Another note, I was asked to speak today about trends in primarily in PRC coercive military activity directed against Taiwan. Depending on how time goes, I might also throw in maybe a point or two about some political warfare issues. But again, we'll see how time goes. In making predictions, so sort of looking ahead to what may happen in 2024, I think making predictions is an excellent way to make a fool of oneself. But I will risk that today with a prediction or two. We'll see how foolish I look later. But looking at the issue of the military activity conducted by the People's Liberation Army, again, the Chinese Communist Party's military arm, directed against Taiwan. I think for many folks who would sort of be looking at cross-strait issues, unless you're maybe a specialist on military issues who really delves into it, I think a lot of people would primarily turn their attention to or think of sort of the very large spike in PLA military activity and the military exercises that were conducted immediately following the August 2022 visit by then Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi. And there certainly was a very significant surge at that time. I would argue, though, I think to get a more comprehensive picture of the military activities that have been undertaken by the leadership of the CCP directed against Taiwan, you have to go back a little bit further. And I would argue that sort of the current phase of these military activities, I would actually go back to late 2016 and then into 2017, where we began to see flights circumnavigating Taiwan conducted by PLA Air Force bombers, like H-6 bombers, who would go through the Bashi Channel and circumnavigate Taiwan. I would identify that as sort of maybe the first sort of prominent step in escalating or sort of more provocative PLA military activity directed against Taiwan. And I think you can see that in a few more phases. I think there was a significant sort of bump up in activities again in 2019, where we began to see PLA aircraft crossing the center line of the Taiwan Strait for the first time. And then getting into the autumn of 2020, following visits to Taiwan by more senior U.S. officials in August of 2020, I believe it was, where Alex Azar, the then Secretary of Health and Human Services, visited Taiwan, followed by a visit by Undersecretary Keith Kropp. In September of that year, immediately following those visits, there was a very substantial spike of PLA, again, and primarily sort of military aviation activity around Taiwan. And it has been steadily creeping up from those points. And so when we get to the August 2022 exercises that were conducted, again, following the visit by then Speaker Pelosi, it was not the start of these activities. It was just sort of a significant ramping up, including some more provocative activities that had not been seen before, at least had not been seen for some time, such as the missile firings directly around Taiwan. I think another following those exercises in August 2022, we also saw again, those PLA military activities continued, and we saw another big spike in April of last year, April 2023, when what the PLA called the United Sharp Sword exercises were conducted around Taiwan. And like the exercises of August 2022, those also followed a noteworthy political event, or were meant to display the CCP's displeasure in a political event, because at that time, Taiwan's President Tsai Ing-wen was taking a trip to visit the ROCs, some of the ROC's diplomatic allies in the Caribbean, and then to make what have always euphemistically been called transit stops in the United States, to include a meeting with then Speaker Kevin McCarthy. So once again, to signal its displeasure with a political event, the CCP dispatched the PLA for another major series of military exercises, including at that time the deployment of the carrier Shandong to waters to the east of Taiwan. As Dr. Lam noted, let's see, in the lead up to the recent elections in Taiwan, there was a lot of speculation as to whether or not there would be like another big surge of PLA military activity, as part of an effort to sort of intimidate or send a message to Taiwan's voters. But again, as Dr. Lam noted, in terms of coercive military activity, the CCP's response has been relatively restrained. We did not see a great deal of that in the immediate lead up to the election. And we haven't seen a great deal of unusually provocative military activity, sort of, a continuance of kind of like routine or stepped up military activity, but no sort of significant surge, which has led a number of people to sort of wonder, why not? Or, where will that be going? I'll get more to that in a moment. We'll note for both the August 2022 and the April 2023 exercises, the CCP propaganda system, the PRC state propaganda system, which is the CCP propaganda system, made a great deal of promoting the narrative that the exercise scenarios were focused on encirclement or blockade of Taiwan. And that was strengthened more in the April 2023 exercises, where again, the aircraft carrier Shandong was sent to the Philippine Sea, at least, nominally, to conduct aviation flights that would be sort of a component of a potential blockade of Taiwan. And in both of those events, I think you can see how PLA military actions they're sort of twofold in their purpose. They do serve a purpose of sort of testing out capabilities and increasing proficiency for their sailors, airmen, and so forth. But the primary purpose is always political. is always to send a political message. And I think it needs to be understood in those terms. Again, the part where I'm going to make a fool of myself, I will offer maybe a prediction or two for the coming year. While we have not seen a big uptick in PLA military activity surrounding the elections, I expect there will be one coming. And my general prediction is that we're going to see that coming around mid-May or around the time of May 20th, when President-elect Xi Jinping will be inaugurated on May 20th. And I would expect that the CCP will want to give an inauguration present of a substantial surge of military activity, possibly including a larger scale exercise and probably involving at least one of the PLA's two operational aircraft carriers. The PLA Navy in the last few years has usually done a spring aircraft carrier and naval task force deployment anyway. For example, they did that in it was May 2022 with the aircraft carrier Liaoning. And they did that again in April of last year, dispatching the aircraft carrier Shandong as part of the Sharp Sword exercise around Taiwan. And so that sort of the annual spring carrier deployment will coincide kind of nicely with Li Qingde's inauguration. So I expect we're going to see a significant uptick in military activity there. Turning from there, I'm going to make just a couple of very brief comments because I don't want to go over time. Kind of more into the political realm of political warfare, what we might see. Around this time last year, in early 2023, there was some speculation to the effect that the CCP, under the leadership of Wang Ling, who now occupies the number 4 ranked position in the Politburo Standing Committee, and has long sort of been known as the CCP's leading ideologist. There was some speculation that he might, or rather, he might contribute to sort of a new ideological framework for unification with Taiwan, one that might supersede the one country, two systems framework that was set in place under Deng Xiaoping in the late 1970s. That doesn't seem to have materialized yet. We have seen a lot in speeches from the CCP leadership over the last couple of years about what they call the party's comprehensive plan for resolving the Taiwan problem in the new era, the 新时代党解决台湾问题总体方略. And again, while that's been invoked a number of times, there doesn't actually seem to be a lot of meat to it in terms of the actual policies. It seems to be sort of a continuation of existing policies that include sort of freezing out Taiwan's current government or current DPP-led government, sort of a refusal to conduct informal negotiations with that government, and instead focusing attention on United Front outreach efforts. Again, what the CCP calls it's people-to-people exchanges, the reaching out to businessmen and to university students and so forth, and trying to sort of cultivate particular selected groups in that way. And in an issue of Qiushi, the CCP's official theoretical journal this past month, there was an article that was published under Xi Jinping's name. Anyway, I very much doubt he actually wrote it, but under his name, that was sort of stressing the importance of United Front work and emphasizing sort of like this is the key to unification with Taiwan. So I will wrap up just by saying, in looking at what we're likely to see, at least over the coming year, I would predict that we're going to see what I call intensified continuity. Not a lot of changes, but I think the CCP has sort of put itself into a policy cage in some way. I think its policies have become kind of rigid. And I don't see much that's really innovative in what they're doing. So I would expect them to keep doing more of the same, but more of the same, if that makes sense. But I'm going to wrap up there and turn the floor over.
Great, thank you so much, Sean. And I think, just listening to your remarks, it occurred to me that, what you described in terms of the evolution of the PLA exercises, that it's important to not focus only on what was happening, immediately to the run up to the elections, but on a more longer continuum of, from the gradual incremental escalation that we've seen, since as recently as 2016 onwards. But it does, strike me that they have essentially kind of normalized, the sort of escalation and provocation, provocative military actions, and it does worry me to some degree if we become completely desensitized to these activities. If the population become desensitized to these activities, to not be vigilant in being able to respond, proactively and countering that. Moreover, the fact that you've noted a very important observation, which is, I think, the underlying political motive for these activities, because I think that factor should be an important variable in our assessments about the considerations of the various scenarios that the PRC is, maybe likely to take as a consequence of the significance it attaches to the political signal, the political motive for any type of military action that it may take, whether it is, an all-out invasion scenario to a blockade or something of a more limited nature. But that important, the political signal, I think, is not lost in any of those situations. Just a matter of degree, right? And what actions am I more likely to take based on its cost benefit calculation will weigh on that. Next, I want to turn it over to Karen because one of the I think notable features in the PRC's coercive toolkit, as it has clearly demonstrated in these elections, were not only military, but perhaps even more so on the economic front. And so here I want to turn it over to you, Karen, to provide your assessment of the PRC's coercive economic strategy and its impact on Taiwan. Where do you see that going forward? Karen, over to you.
Thank you so much, Russell, for you and GTI for inviting me to be part of the panel today. And I'm honored to be part of such a distinguished group of experts. Before I start, I want to mention that CRS, where I work, works exclusively for Congress. And so as we get into discussion, CRS does not take a position on any policies or legislation that Congress may be considering. So just to mention that. I want to cover three things as subsets of what you laid out. One, I want to just mention very briefly how I see China's approach to economic coercion generally, specific elements vis-a-vis Taiwan specifically, and then highlight some issues that I'm watching for 2024, how these things might play out. So just very briefly in opening, I think there are a couple things with regard to how China is using economic coercion generally. One is China's coercion toolkit involves both incentives and pressures. And I think that's not always well understood. And I think we saw this in the election campaign for the presidency and for the LY, with also timed to what John was saying, April of 2023, China's PRC Ministry of Commerce announcing a huge trade investigation into Taiwan trade barriers. That does a couple things, right? It gives Beijing, it's a reminder that the benefits of ECFA, the Economic Framework Cooperation Agreement from 2010, can be given and taken away by Beijing at any time. It also allowed Beijing, right, in a couple weeks before the election to impose, basically retract certain tariff preferences for 12 petrochemical tariff items. So there's an agility, an ability to sequence, and a complex interplay between incentives and disincentives. And a lot of this is unique to China because of the levers that the PRC state, government, the party, have over the economy and have over the commercial ecosystem in particular. That gives them a lot of agility to basically dial up and dial down these different economic incentives and different economic pressures. The other key element of this toolkit that Beijing uses is playing up division. leveraging division for Beijing's advantage. And this can be division across sectors, among countries, as far as who gets certain benefits, who doesn't. And I think in the case of Taiwan right now, and I'll talk about it as I look out to 2024, but you have divided government, right? You have the executive being very powerful in Taiwan, controlled by the DPP. You have the KMT doing fairly well, a strong role in the LY. And then you have some political analysis coming out that the TPP, even with just a few seats, 8 seats, may not just play a deal breaker role, but has a positive agenda that they want to insert into the process. So, and we also had a lot of cross-strait economic issues feature in the campaign, right? This issue about all parties seem to want stability across the strait, but to what extent do you want dialogue? To what extent do you want economic ties to deepen with the PRC? To what extent do you want economic ties to diversify? Beijing may play on these threads, right? You have different areas of emphasis among the parties, among individuals within the parties. I think, also in this general toolkit, one other thing I would say is I think there's a growing use of economic coercion by Beijing. I think that's fairly well accepted and understood. And there's growing action to kind of support the victims of coercion, but there's been less attention to an agreement not to backfill when Beijing uses coercion. So meaning if one party is advantaged and another party is disadvantaged, are there restraints on the party that gets the advantages? And I think there's also, one could argue, there's been limited specific direct consequence to Beijing for its behavior. There's been indirect consequence in the sense of creating a greater sense of economic market risk or concern about what is your overall economic exposure to China because of what they might do with these levers. But there's been no direct economic consequence to Beijing. And we see this as Beijing has tried over the past year to reset economic partnerships, starting with Australia, looking at CEO visits, trying to recreate relations with the EU, and then finally with the United States, right? This idea of trying to come back to the table as if this use of economic coercion more generally over the past couple of years hadn't happened. And I think the other thing I would mention is that whether Beijing thinks it's an offensive move or a defensive move in its use of economic tools may affect the tool that it uses. And so when we look at, tools that, Beijing uses in a positive sense, creating incentives, those tend to be rolled out at a time when Beijing is setting the agenda in an offensive way. You tend to see more of the sticks when Beijing is reacting. So what John was saying, reacting to a congressional visit, reacting to an action that Taiwan has taken. In the case of the election, I think you saw an interplay of both. And the other thing I would say is that often you see China using economic coercion in ways that benefit itself economically. It chooses to use things that, it'll pick on a sector or a part of the market that is having a downturn. It doesn't need at the current time. However, I think over time, I'm seeing more of China being willing to play brinkmanship and imposing consequences on parts of the economy that really matter to China. So they're depending on other countries putting up with this and coming back to the table, putting on certain barriers and then lifting them. With regard to Taiwan, I think there are a couple of very specific elements I'll just highlight briefly. One is that Taiwan is very dependent economically on the global system. 70% of Taiwan's GDP is dependent on the outside global economy, especially trade. And within that construct, Taiwan is especially dependent on economic interaction with the PRC. So 2021, 42% of Taiwan's exports went to the PRC. What's interesting, it's declined by about 7% looking at 2023 data. So there are some efforts and some economic factors that are mitigating that a little bit, but huge dependency. So when China uses these tools, these economic coercive measures against Taiwan, they have oversized impact potentially because of Taiwan's exposure in general. I think the other thing that's unique to Taiwan or special to Taiwan is that China's use of economic coercion is both it's done both within the cross-strait context, giving Taiwan investors incentives to immigrate or invest in the PRC, for example, and sticks being used. But there's a global context to pressuring and incentivizing Taiwan. And we see this in particular with regard to Taiwan's participation in global economic organizations and the role they can play. We see it with the extent to which Taiwan can have free trade agreements with countries around the world. And so I think that there are two levels at which China is operating. The other unique element, and I defer to the political scientists on the panel, but I think this PRC Xi Jinping concept of what is the role of overseas Chinese, what is the role of ethnic Chinese? We saw it in the campaign, this idea of the two sides, one family, right? And so I think in looking at and you have extensive ties, economic, social, cultural that go on, across. So Hong Kong is its own place. Taiwan is its own place. But I think there are examples of how we've already seen Beijing play in using economic coercion, incentives, and pressures that are different because of this connectivity that they see and that they have. And I think in that regard, I would also mention that I think it's very important in the economic realm. There are coercive measures that are visible, and there are coercive measures that are not visible. And I think we saw during the election campaign, the DPP legislators who called out that certain Taiwan executives were receiving pressure to not support the government's efforts to promote investment in Jinmen. I'm not sure people would have known about that. And so I think there's a unique effort in Taiwan that I've seen. You have it in other parts of the world, but to call out the corporate pressure, because corporate pressure is one area where companies don't like to talk about how they're being pressured or incentivized. And I think this is an area where Beijing has had a lot of influence and play because it's not exposed and you don't have counter pressures as a result. So quickly, as far as issues ahead, I'll go very briefly just so I don't go over time. I look at kind of what is the PRC trying to promote and constrain, and what is Taiwan trying to promote and constrain is how I'm thinking about this. So for the PRC, in the past, they've denied the DPP access to dialogue and the ability to deepen economic ties. And there are debates about whether or not the DPP wants that or not. But I think it would be interesting, that the traditional playbook would be that Beijing would look to the opposition parties and offer meetings and trips and other opportunities. I'm not sure how, Beijing may play this in a traditional way, they may not. I think it's just something to watch. I think this leverage of companies is something that I expect to see more of, because I've seen it more with other companies from outside Taiwan. We saw this whole effort, for example, with the European Union. Beijing first had a lot of meetings with CEOs. Before then, it met with government leaders, using business to pressure the government side. And I think we may see that more in the Taiwan context as well. And then I think, you mentioned, Russell, the economic slowdown in China. There's also debate about to what extent Xi Jinping has a handle on the economy more generally. And so, if there is a handle on the economy, if they are serious and seriously worried about the downturn and what to do about it, there are certain incentives in play, some specific to Taiwan, some more general that will affect Taiwan. So you have existing Taiwan investment and trade incentives. You have a new pilot in Zhejiang province to attract Taiwan investment in immigration specifically. You also have, under the 14th five-year plan in China, a focus on very particular sectors that are relevant to Taiwan, particular semiconductors, and in particular, these pilots on e-commerce and services. Taiwan's economy, almost 60% services. I think that's an area where there may be efforts on the incentive side to try to counter Taiwan government efforts to diversify Taiwan business out of the PRC. You also have the PRC's push for its own trade agreements, FTA negotiating with Switzerland, and also Beijing's bid for CPTPP at the same time that Taiwan has also put in an application for CPTPP. I think that's something to watch this year about how much both sides push for that and how much in particular Beijing tries to prevent Taiwan from having that opportunity. And then very quickly, what Taiwan might seek to promote or constrain. So you have the issue of cross-strait trade and investment. So the extent to which there may be consideration of exceptions or restrictions on, there's a lot of involvement of Taiwan in the development of China's semiconductor sector. There have been high-profile IP theft and talent poaching incidents. There's been shifts within Taiwan on legislation and rules with regard to economic security and IP theft. To what extent that will continue, concerns about critical infrastructure and PRC investment in Taiwan in areas like media, ports. To what extent will that continue? Will that intensify? Will that lessen up? Taiwan is also, firms are part of global supply chains. So a company like Apple, as Tim Cook is navigating pressures to stay in China and pressures to get out of China, Huanhai Foxconn is very much part of that. They're not just making their own decisions, they're part of that broader infrastructure. And then I would say, Taiwan had its investment agreement with Canada last year. They're looking for talks, it looks like from reading media reports, with the European Union. You have last year the signing of the US-Taiwan first agreement under the 21st century trade framework with the United States. And then you also have moves in the Congress. There's draft legislation looking at a potential corporate tax agreement. And you still have support in parts of Congress for more than what an IPEF or 21st century structure would give for an actual, some type of FTA or free trade agreement. So I think all of these things could be in play and could have both offensive and defensive dynamics for how Beijing might choose to use its economic carrots and economic sticks vis-a-vis Taiwan. So I stop there. I've gone long. But thank
you so much, Karen. Really, I think you made some really perceptive observations there, and too many to really just summarize at this point. But I think your point about brinkmanship and how that may be a new quality in how the PRC engages in economic coercion is. It's important to highlight as we enter the next 4 years under the Xiao administration in the ways in which the PRC may ramp up this economic tool in its coercive toolkit. And the other point about the explicit and implicit conditions of economic coercion is really on point. And this similarly reminds me of another area in which the PRC engages in its influence operations in Taiwan, but not only in Taiwan, but other democracies as well, which is through its information and disinformation, and its ability to utilize what some political scientists refer to as sharp power in order to censor others, and much of that censorship comes from also not only explicitly in blocking messages, but also incentivizing people to self-censor, themselves, and that limitation of expression can be found both in, obviously in verbal form, but also in economic terms as well. And that's just a parallel that I saw in terms of the effect of the types of means that the PRC is using in the economic realm, that as you've really particularly described, plays out in other spaces as well. So Alice, I want to turn it over to you now. We've laid a lot on the table for you to analyze and for you to unpack here for us, because obviously much of our discussion here has been on cross-strait relations and how Taiwan's elections and domestic politics can impact that in terms of how Beijing may respond. But of course, the United States is an important player in all of this as well. And so I want to turn the floor over to you now to give us your assessment on the future of U.S.-Taiwan relations and the policy implications for the United States from Taiwan's most recently held presidential and legislative elections. Alex, over to you.
Great. Russell, can you hear me okay?
Yep, loud and clear.
Perfect. Well, I appreciate being included on this distinguished panel, and as the recovering bureaucrat in the room, I will take it a little more DC centric and a little more DC politics to kind of, we're in an election year in the United States, just as Taiwan is coming out of their election year, and so everything that we're going to be seeing in terms of U.S.-Taiwan relations this year really can't be separated from the reality that the United States is going into our election. And that's just the reality. And so I guess I would kind of take this a couple different ways and go down the list of some of the macro trends that I'm watching as it relates to U.S.-Taiwan relations in that context. Number one, President Biden is dealing with crises in Europe with Ukraine. He's dealing with multiple crises in the Middle East. I think the reality is that the Biden administration is going to spend the next 11 months doing everything it can to keep the Indo-Pacific stable. They don't need a third region in flames. And so I think what you're going to see, and we've already seen this with the high-level visits to the PRC, Secretary Yellen, Secretary Blinken, the conversations that we had in San Francisco, you're going to see a very significant effort to find areas of commonality with the PRC to keep that relationship at least at a low boil. And what that means, in my view, for U.S.-Taiwan relations is you're going to have a natural tension over the next 11 months. You're going to have a give and take where Taiwan's immediate needs in some instances are going to have to be balanced against this, what I think is a political and strategic imperative for the Biden administration to manage tensions in the Indo-Pacific while they focus on a very serious crisis in Ukraine and an expanding crisis in the Middle East. That means that Taiwan, particularly as the Lai administration is getting spun up, is going to see some of their priorities wade through that prism that I just described. And I think that's going to create a natural tension, and we're going to have to see how that works out. A couple of areas in which I would highlight the potential for that tension to manifest itself as we go into U.S. election season. One, and Russell and I have done some work on this together, is Taiwan's international space. And how is Taiwan, we've seen the Lai administration, when he was campaigning, talk, I think, very eloquently about, as he's tried to differentiate himself a little bit from his predecessor, defending Taiwan's international space even more vigorously than the Tsai administration. And I think that's going to put a natural tension with the Biden administration because, as we see with the recent situation in Nauru, as we are likely to see in the other diplomatic allies, as we're likely to see PRC pressure and coercion in international bodies like the UN, you're going to see a forcing function where the United States is going to have to make very difficult decisions about how aggressively does it want to come to Taiwan's defense, both internally and externally, to defend Taiwan's international space. And I think as we approach the May inauguration, you're going to see Taiwan facing in my view, and I'll follow John's lead here and make a prediction that may come back to bite me. I think you're going to see an unprecedented effort by the PRC over the next 6 months to switch diplomatic recognition across the board. I think you're going to see it in the Pacific. I think you'll see it in all the remaining Pacific islands. I think you'll see it in the Western Hemisphere. I think you'll see it in Africa. It's going to be a really aggressive push, and the Biden administration is going to have to make a strategic decision about how aggressively it wants to push back. We saw this when I was in government. There is a natural hesitancy, and this is bipartisan, there's a natural hesitancy by large parts of the US bureaucracy to want to go out on a limb in those situations. I dealt with it in the Solomon Islands and in Kiribati. There's just a hesitancy. There's a view within large swaths of the US bureaucracy that it's a lost cause to fight on behalf of Taiwan's diplomatic space. And so that's going to, I think, very quickly come to the fore as a pain point between the Lai and Biden administrations. Next, I think you're going to see this question of strategic ambiguity come up again and again and again. I think it did not get the attention it deserves, but former President Trump basically reiterated that he supports strategic ambiguity. It was a statement that I think, obviously, it was not phrased in the traditional Washington speak, but if you unpack what he said, he was essentially calling for a return to strategic ambiguity. And that obviously is a contrast with President Biden's repeated efforts to take us towards a more overt stance in support of Taiwan's the status quo in Taiwan. And so I think you're going to see, as the two U.S. political parties gear up for a Trump-Biden election, you're going to see this really come to the fore in a way that's going to create interesting dissonance for the Lai administration. They're going to be confronted with a Biden administration that is a president who has repeatedly said unambiguously that the United States will support Taiwan in the event of a kinetic action by the PRC. And you're going to have a contrast with a President Trump who practiced strategic ambiguity in office and who, as a candidate again, said he would not want Xi Jinping to know how he would react. And so that's going to be, I think, something that the PRC is going to be watching, something the Lai administration is going to have to be confronted with. How do they want to position themselves when there are two very different visions for how to handle that pillar of the relationship? And finally, I know we're running a little over time. The final thing I would say is, I should say two final things. One is, as we approach the U.S. election season, one of the main points of dissonance on the approach to Taiwan actually has nothing directly to do with Taiwan. It's the question of Ukraine. And this is going to be at the forefront of the presidential election in the United States. And I think we all who watch Taiwan policy closely understand just how interconnected the policy choices on Ukraine are for outcomes in the Taiwan Strait. We are watching that issue come to the forefront, I think, of Republican Party politics in the United States from a very diametrically different position from where the Biden administration is. And that debate, which I think we're going to see just grow in intensity over the next 11 months, that debate is going to be very uncomfortable for the Lai administration. And it's going to force some very difficult conversations, both, I think, internally in Taiwan about what does that mean for U.S. commitments to Taiwan. And it's also going to force some very awkward conversations in the United States about levels of potential commitment to Taiwan as we're thinking about our obligations and organizing ourselves to respond to our interests and our obligations. That debate's going to be really catalyzing in a lot of ways, and it's going to make a lot of people uncomfortable globally. And then finally, I would say, this is, as we think about U.S. Taiwan policy, we're all familiar with and we're all tracking the challenges of getting the approved arms sales from the United States to Taiwan in a timely manner. This gets to the question of the U.S. defense industrial base and the strength of the U.S. defense industrial base. Ukraine was really highlighted this for the world, just how much of a challenge it is for the U.S. to provide the things that our partners and allies need in a timely manner. The Biden administration is working, I think, very diligently to try and fix some of those systemic challenges, but that, particularly in the context of this larger policy debate on Ukraine, this is going to be something that's going to, I think, be a really definitional discussion for both folks in Taiwan and in DC. To put a fine point on it, if the United States can't provide Taiwan the weapons that we have approved for them as part of our TRA obligations, whatever that reason is, in this case, it happens to be because of industrial-based challenges and shortfalls, that calls into question our commitment as a partner, whatever the president, whoever he is or she is saying about ambiguity or not ambiguity. The hard power capability to get those weapon systems to Taipei is a definitional issue in the relationship. And so that, to me, is going to be in the background of all the conversations that we're having about Taiwan policy for the next year. So with that, Russell, thank you again, and I would leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Alex. I think you've given us a lot of food for thought, and actually, I think you really tied in the the opening of this event, Taiwan's elections and how that the results of that election and how that relate to our elections here come November. And certainly, you've done I think a very an excellent job in underscoring how these issues are very much interrelated and tied to one another, and really and thank you so much for really tying it all nicely together for us to really to further discuss here in our now turning to our moderated discussion. I know that we have about. All right. Well, in the interest of time, since we only have to 1:30, I will yield my moderator's prerogative and open the floor for questions and answers. So please raise your hand as well as this. Maybe no one want me to use a microphone anymore. Here, I'll just speak up, but please state your name as well as your affiliation. Oh, maybe that's the microphone. No, I think that might be the microphone. That might be giving you an issue. So,
Yeah. I think close to the receiver.
Okay. All right. Say your name. Oh, look, I think now we can start. Oh, yeah. So, say your name as well as your affiliation, and then please direct your question. Direct your question, please.
Thanks, Russell. Natalie Liu with Voice of America. Just as my good colleague Tina Chung is from Voice of America too. Just to quickly follow up what the last speaker, Alex, was saying. Alex, you worked for Mr. Trump in the last administration, the Trump administration. And may we ask whether you are currently advising him or his campaign, and also given the differentiation you pointed out between President Biden's more affirmative statements on Taiwan and Mr. Trump's previous insistence on ambiguity. Do you think President Trump, now candidate Trump, may be adapting his position to a more clarified or clear position on this issue? And also on the question you raised, the issue you pointed out, the correlation between Ukraine and Taiwan. I happen to also cover Ukraine some. And I mean, given it's granted that there is lots of people around the world tie the cause and the fate of Ukraine with the cause and the fate of Taiwan. But I'd like to point out that the Freedom Caucus in the United States Congress advocates for restricted or for reconsideration of aiding Ukraine precisely because they want to make sure that resources are there in the event of a PRC provocation in the Taiwan Strait or anywhere else in the Indo-Pacific. So is it fair to differentiate the two clauses and make a more nuanced observation of what, say, the Republican Party audiences, the Republican average voter and Republican representatives in the United States Congress, how they view the fate, the cause of Ukraine versus what may happen, how the United States treats Taiwan, because their number one concern is the threat coming from Beijing. Thank you.
Well, that's a lot of good points and questions there. I would start off by just saying I don't have any formal affiliation with President Trump's campaign, speaking only for myself and my 4 years having worked for him previously. On the question of Taiwan and his position on ambiguity and how is he positioning himself on that, I would just if you look at the public record and you look what he said and did in office, I think that he is reverting back, or I don't think he's changed. I think he is basically has had the same position in his whole public life on this topic. I would encourage everyone to ignore what was, leaks in the newspaper and speculation about things that may have been said in meetings, and look at what he has said directly on this topic. And I think that has been a very traditional approach to strategic ambiguity, because he believes that the best way to preserve deterrence in the Indo-Pacific is by keeping the United States' capabilities, not capabilities, the United States' intentions purposely ambiguous. That's his view, and that's how he operated for 4 years in the White House. And if you look at his most recent statements, he explicitly said there is value in Xi Jinping not knowing how I would respond as president. He has also been very clear that he views deterrence primarily as a hard power effort, and having the capability and capacity in the Indo-Pacific to deter kinetic activity by the PRC. He views that as far more important than making a statement about what he would or would not do in a specific circumstance. So I think that's his publicly stated view, and I think that's pretty clear. To your last point about Ukraine, look, I think that there is absolutely a view in the US Congress and by some very prominent right-leaning defense intellectuals, folks like Bridge Colby, who's a dear friend of mine, who believe that there are trade-offs between supporting Ukraine and supporting Taiwan. And as a strategic prioritization, we have to prioritize limited defense industrial resources for Taiwan. There is a articulate, well-said view in Washington along those lines. You mentioned the Freedom Caucus. I'm sure there are members of the Freedom Caucus that have made similar arguments. I know there are plenty of folks in the Republican Party who've made that argument. What I would just say is this is not a normative judgment. This is, I think, a statement of fact. There is no question in my mind that actors globally, whether they're friends or foes, view our level of commitment to Taiwan as an indication, or to Ukraine as an indication of how we will respond in other situations. That is not to say that there aren't difficult trade-offs in terms of materiel and hard power between Ukraine and Taiwan. There certainly are, and I've been on defense industrial base issues for a long time now. And I think because we've allowed that base to atrophy, we're forced to make harder choices than we should have to. But I would just go back again to the point that I think it is unambiguous that there is a perception that American will, as it relates to defending Ukraine's sovereignty, is viewed by friend and foe alike as directly correlated to our willingness to defend Taiwan. And that's, I think that's just an indisputable fact. And so as we think about this issue, we have to balance the challenges of what are our capabilities to aid Ukraine with the very real perception problems that we're going to face if we are seen as letting up on our commitment there, and the implications of that for other things like deterrence in the Taiwan Strait.
Great. All right, raise your hands and then, okay, let's go to the front over here. Okay. Oh.
Thank you, gentlemen. I'm Joshua Park from South Australia Navy Captain Torn and currently visiting scholar at George Mason University. Thank you for this beautiful the work. And my question want to direct at Dr. Ram. Then my question is the result of this Taiwanese election, including presidential election and legislative election, is there any possibility in Beijing to review their Taiwan unification policy? And I believe that basically Beijing has two hands in order to unify Taiwan, which is simply carrot and stick. Sometimes unification, unified front line, they tried friendly to Taiwanese as the same nation. On the other hand, by using use of force or economic means, it's sort of stick. Sometimes they mix two hands, sometimes they use one hand, the other. Then by using this present election, 3 times in a law, PPP1 as a present, the most disliked party by Beijing. It's sort of, failure. Well, failure of Beijing's unification policy. Then at this point, is there any possibility Beijing review their unification policy to Taiwan? It means they discarded one hand. They just have only one hand, stick or carrot. And that's my question to you. Thank you, sir.
Oh, thank you very much. Well, I think even though I don't have any hard and fast pieces of evidence that Beijing is reviewing its Taiwan policy. Well, first of all, we are not certain, of course, the exact form or shape that Beijing might take in the kind of a generally described nation of Taiwan. I think that at least until recently, the possibility of a full-scale invasion, which would incur a large number of casualties on both sides, is, or at least until recently, unlikely. My information is that most likely it would be started by an attempt to blockade the island, followed by Beijing supporting a potently enough fifth column within Taiwan, so that they would declare on national television that the members of the fifth column, supposedly the members of the KMT, would declare that now they are taking over, they are beginning negotiation with Beijing, and that Beijing would grant A to Z preferential policies to Taiwan and so forth. However, the performance of the KMT, even though they managed to get 35% of the votes and they managed to get a almost clear-cut majority in the legislative board, shows that the value of this fifth column, if it were to consist mostly of candidates, might have to be assessed because of the well, shall I say, dissatisfactory performance of KMT candidate. Mr. Hao obviously charisma, and yeah, we have the same problems with the former candidate, president candidate 4 years ago. So it shows that if Beijing is relying on this tactic of a blockade plus a potently enough fifth column taking over, they have to reassess how to nurture a more effective and reliable fifth column within Taiwan. The next question is the assessment of the reentry from the DPP. Well, the first reaction from the Taiwan Affairs Office after the election was that the election shows that the DPP cannot the majority within Taiwan society. However, one of the most important forms of the elections is that the DPP has pulled off something which nobody else has done before. That is to secure a third term, and unless something expected would happen, it's quite likely that they will get a fourth term. And then beyond that, it's quite likely that Vice President Kim will become the candidate after 8 years of running the show. And of course, Beijing has many reasons to be even more suspicious about Ms. Xiao because of her connections with the US. So Beijing has to reassess the possibility of overall sentiment in Taiwan, because we all know that the so-called mainlanders, together with the descendants who came over from the mainland to Taiwan in the late 40s and early 50s, they are either as old as myself or older or no longer around. Okay, so even though in the 8 years of the Chinese administration, her administration has not gone overboard in trying, for example, in Taiwanese schools to nurture a separate identity, is the fact that if the ruling party remains the DPP, and this will go on for at least 8 years, perhaps even if Ms. Xiao becomes a candidate for the fifth round, even longer than 8 years, then in terms of national identification, in terms of the sentiments of the Taiwanese people, the distance between Taiwan and the mainland in terms of culture, in terms of ethnicity, in terms of values and so forth, might be widened. It might be widened to the extent that even now, according to the interviews done by thousands of reporters who have covered the election, few people in Taiwan really identify themselves with the mainland, except business reasons. Okay, particularly given the example, the negative example of Hong Kong. Okay, so I think Beijing has to make quick assessments on these two scores. That means the possibility that they might nurture a more open and reliable fifth column, and also the possibility that the DPP will remain the ruling party for at least 8 years or even longer, would widen the cultural ethnic values oriented divide between Taiwan and the mainland. So if the assessment turns in a particular way, there's a possibility that Xi's decision to use hard force might increase, because we all know it's not secret that more and more native born Taiwanese, which constitute over 90% of the population, don't want to peacefully be on the mainland. Right, okay.
Now, I know we have so many questions in your audience, and just to give, our online, speakers, if you need to drop off, to attend to your next appointment, feel free to do so. But I think since we have such a large number of, interest and engagement from the audience here, I just want to maybe do a lightning round of questions here, to allow, our speakers to respond. And so let's go in front over here, then over to Garrett, and then over to the gentleman in the back. Okay, and then we'll take another set.
Thank you so much for the discussion. My name is Yuko Mukai from Japanese newspaper Yomiuri and also non-resident Federal Project 2049. My question is the relevance about the Taiwan and South China Sea. So Beijing is clearly raising the tension in South China Sea, conflicting with Philippines. What does it mean for Beijing to take control in South China Sea in terms of invading Taiwan militarily? And also, do you see any political intention to name the new defense minister, which has a South China Sea background?
Okay, is this directed at John? Okay, it sounds like this is not a good word down there. Okay, so, and then we'll look at Garrett.
Jared Van Overhees, teaching history of Taiwan at George Mason University, also advisor here at GTI. Hasn't been a question for Karen yet, so here's one for you, Karen. Economic sanctions can work both ways, and they will affect China too. And of course, Europe and the United States together have used economic sanctions very effectively against Russia. What role could economic sanctions play in deterring China from blockading or attacking Taiwan? How can the US and Europe use those more effectively?
Thank you. Hello, my name is Vincent Zhang. I'm a senior at Georgetown University, as well as a young professional at the East West Center. I just wanted to follow up on Mrs. Sutter's mention of Taiwan's semiconductor industry. Semiconductors are absolutely indispensable to the world. I think every single thing with a screen here in this room has a semiconductor. I'm willing to bet most of them are from Taiwan. Vis-a-vis cross-strait relations and the US-Taiwan relationship, both Chinese and US defense systems and platforms rely heavily on these semiconductors to operate. In the second quarter of 2023, Taiwan's semiconductor manufacturing company reported a market share of 56.4% in the global semiconductor manufacturing foundry market, which is 5 times higher than Samsung, the company with the next highest market share. Former White House National Security Advisor Robert C. O'Brien was quoted last April with the following: "The United States and its allies are never going to let those semiconductor factories fall into Chinese hands," and drew a comparison between the destruction of those factories and Winston Churchill's bombing of a French naval fleet after the country surrendered to Nazi Germany. The U.S. Treasury Department has published at least 2 studies on the overall market impact of an invasion, and the National Security Council is currently conducting a study on semiconductors and U.S. dependencies on TMSC. I'd be interested in hearing the panel's thoughts on Taiwan's indisputable global leadership in the market for semiconductor manufacturing and how it can impact the trilateral U.S.-China-Taiwan dynamic.
All right, so we got 3 questions there for the audience. I think, Karen, 2 of the questions are economic related, so I'm going to perhaps turn those to you if you'd like to address those, and then John address the military implications of the South China Sea for a Taiwan scenario. Karen, over to you.
Happy to do that. I'll start with the last question and I'll back into the sanctions question that came before. I think it's interesting that President-elect Lai in his acceptance speech highlighted the semiconductor sector. He talked about Taiwan's semiconductor sector as a public good. And I think this reflects some internal debates that I have seen within Taiwan, this discussion of Taiwan's Silicon Shield, to shorthand. But this issue, to what extent, Taiwan has a very robust 5+2 investment strategy to expand investment on the island in emerging technologies, including semiconductors. There's a debate about the extent to which Taiwan should be expanding and supporting the development of the PRC semiconductor sector. That's not unique to Taiwan. There are debates on that in the United States, Europe, and other spots. But Taiwan, as was pointed out, because of its foundry role, has kind of a unique position. And then there's some debate about the extent to which Taiwan companies should take advantage of new incentives being offered in the United States, Japan, Europe, India, and other economies to diversify because of this risk of concentrating so much capability on the island and also the ability to expand in general globally. And so when I read President-elect Lai's remarks, that's what I thought about. I think, when Taiwan does play a very unique role in the leadership in the supply chain, especially with regard to fabrication. Taiwan firms also are active in design in other parts of the supply chain as well. I think, economic sanctions, that approach is kind of one extreme of the spectrum. I would highlight that I think there are decision points that are before us right now on that spectrum. And they relate to two specific areas, both revolving around, one revolving around export controls, the other revolving around investment approval and restrictions coming out of Taiwan. So, the Washington Post goes back now almost 2 years, Ellen Nakashima ran a story that talked about, they found that in data they looked at, that the PRC software firm Phytium that supports China's hypersonic missile program was designing chips and fabricating them in Taiwan. And so as a result of that, you had action by the US government to put Phytium on the US entity list under export controls. And then you also had the Taiwan government saying that it would also honor that. It does raise the question about what other types of fabrication is going on within Taiwan for other firms that are not restricted, and what that means for Taiwan economically as well as geopolitically. And then in the other sense, you have the new Biden administration restrictions and export controls and investment guardrails, both under the CHIPS Act and implementing the CHIPS Act guardrails, and then also the new executive order for the export of advanced semiconductor chip technology. You have two South Korean firms, Samsung and SK Hynix. First, you had a waiver for a year that was given to South Korea and Taiwan. Then you had Samsung and SK Hynix applying for exemptions under the BIS validated end user program that happened this fall. There are Taiwan press reports that TSMC has applied for a similar waiver exemption process. Basically, it loosens some of the requirements for export controls going to these companies' facilities in the PRC with regard to dual-use semiconductor technology. I think it raises a question, and this debate, again, it's not just Taiwan, but it's because we're talking about Taiwan. It's also about US and US industry. But, to what extent is China such a large market that if you're not supporting and expanding in that market, you can't compete globally, you can't put money back into your R&D cycle, or to what extent are Taiwan companies, engineers, expertise, as well as from the United States, Europe, and others, building China's capabilities in a strategic dual-use sector. I think that's fundamental because, these are the questions before us today, and the answers to these questions and the decisions on these points are going to matter a lot as far as, it's not just about diversification and exposure. PRC is very dependent at this point in time on foreign talent, foreign IP, and technology equipment, software to do certain things in this sector where China has industrial policies that it wants to take a commanding position in all parts of the value chain in the semiconductor sector. And I think that's different than Taiwan that has a leading position in the foundry area and other parts of the supply chain. PRC industrial policies want to position China as the dominant party in all parts of the supply chain. And I think that's a very different proposition. So I'm not answering it totally, but I think these are the things to look at and think about.
Thank you. Well, John, bring us on.
Okay, thank you very much for the question. I'll try to give as brief an answer as I can. In terms of the PRC's, very aggressive actions towards the Philippines that we've seen in recent months, I think in very broad terms, it comes for, there are three reasons for it. One is, I think a genuinely held set of expansionist nationalist impulses by the CCP. I think they have the mentality that this is indeed by right their maritime territory. I personally disagree, but I think the second reason very much does relate to Taiwan. The PRC is interested in longer term sort of making an encirclement of Taiwan and effective control of the South China Sea, particularly accompanied by the introduction of a greater military presence in the South China Sea, which we've certainly seen the PLA doing over the past 10 to 20 years, takes a big step towards that encirclement of Taiwan. And with that, trying to by controlling that maritime territory to try to further push away foreign forces that might potentially complicate the PRC's plans for Taiwan. So yes, I think that's absolutely a component of it. A third reason I think that doesn't get so much discussion or attention perhaps is I think the leadership of the PRC, the CCP leadership, sees it as an imperative to try to break up the U.S.-led alliance system in Asia. And the United States has formal security alliances with at least three prominent states in Asia Pacific, with Japan, with South Korea, with the Philippines, as well as perhaps the ambiguous security commitment to Taiwan, which would take up another hour of discussion, which I won't go into. But I think from the perspective of the CCP leadership, I think they also look at the Philippines as perhaps the weakest link in that chain that they might try to break. And I also think from their perspective, aggressive acts directed against the Philippines provide a lower cost option than would be the case like similar actions directed against Japan, for example. And so I think in a way they're hoping to make an example out of the Philippines and to show U.S. security commitments as being weak, and also using that as an opportunity to sort of gauge the U.S. response and how committed the United States makes itself to supporting the Philippines in that. So I think all those reasons are bound in PRC actions. I actually think, though, that it's backfiring on them. And I think it's yet another example of sort of the blinkered mentality or worldview that the CCP has. I think their very aggressive actions towards the Philippines are in many ways producing the opposite effect of what they hope to get or what they hope to see, perhaps in a similar way to how I think Vladimir Putin saw as another motive for invading Ukraine, hoping that it was going to break up NATO, and it produced the opposite effect of solidifying NATO. And I see that dynamic, or a similar dynamic anyway, taking place in regards to the PRC actions towards the Philippines.
Well, we apologize for going well over time, but as you can see, there's a lot for us to discuss here, and we can probably spend several hours more to really unpack everything that was put on the table here. But please join me in thanking our panelists. And I'm sure they'll be able to, the panelists will be able to take your questions. Thank you so much, Karen. I really appreciate your contribution to the discussion here today, and look forward to engaging with you further in the future on these very timely and really important issues that will be at the forefront, I think, of cross-strait in U.S.-Taiwan relations going forward. So thank you very much.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
All right. Thank you. Yeah, yeah. I think Aaron.